Firstly, I have to pass on apologies from Lisa McManus, who would normally be here and was very looking forward to introducing you today. But before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the Liaquat people in the land on which we meet today and acknowledge the leaders past, present and future. And it gives me great pleasure today to introduce Hossain, who is visiting us from Hong Kong and has such an impressive bio that I'm going to just have to select a few highlights. But if you've seen from the advertisement that was sent around, Professor Hossain is the head of Division of Information Technology Studies at the University of Hong Kong, an honorary professor at the University of Sydney, a senior research associate in information analytics at Lund University in Sweden. So as you know, we're living in an increasingly complex world, which comprises of many layers of micro and macro systems in varying complexity. And I think the work that you're going to be presenting today will touch a lot of the different work that you're all doing in different ways. So that's I'm very much looking forward to your talk.
So you're working very much.
Well, that's right. And so I mean, my PhD was in cognitive neuroscience, so I'm thinking about this, right?
Yeah.
So I've been thinking about some of this type of analytics in a very different context. So hopefully we'll have a good discussion afterwards as well. So Professor Hossain has been investigating the functioning and robustness of hierarchical structures and potential problem leading to disruption or delay in the adaptation of behaviours for optimal functioning. His research aims to explore resilience, robustness, accuracy and precision of information flow in organisational, community and engineered complex systems. He's also been using social media analytics and social networks to explore disaster and crisis management and understanding resilience for dealing with disasters related to flood, fire, tsunami, disease breakouts and so on. He has a very impressive record of competitive grant funding from both Australian and international sources, and we're very much looking forward to it and very happy to have you here.
Thank you.
So I'll pass over to you.
Thank you. So it's always a humbling experience to come to a place, and I wanted to thank a number of distinguished colleagues here, particularly Professor Douglas Patton and also Professor Timothy Skinner, for being instrumental in also energizing the whole system to send an invitation to me. So I think there's a lot of background work that went in, but I think there are a few other colleagues like Alexandra, and in fact I was interested, looked at computational neuroscience, how it works, and that she did at Oxford was fascinating, nicely connects with psychology and all the things, experimental psychology work they do here. But Lawrence Cram, who's been the driver of this, and it was also nice for the provost of the university to take time for a dinner, and the PVC Economics and Business. So I was given a very nice welcome by a group of people saying that, look, we want to do something exciting together, there's support there. So I'm very excited, so I thank colleagues for that, and thanks graduate students and others. Now, one of the interesting things that I want to talk about is that, interactions, connections, and how do we predict who will connect with whom? Now, there has been a lot of interest. In fact, one of this foundation theoretical work that came out in Nature by Stoddart, who's an Australian, he's quite a nice bodybuilder. He's a Cornell professor, Professor Stoddart, and he's almost like a muscle builder. So Professor Stoddart worked with Watts, Duncan Watts and Stoddart. They worked together, and one of the interesting things they were looking at is formation of clusters. What makes things to come together, attract with each other, for example? Is there something chemicals? Is there something networks and structure? And what they found is that they discovered an interesting phenomenon that's been studied quite well in physics and also in social sciences, and it has application in psychology and other areas, is homophily, which is basically how do we detect changes where you could predict who would affiliate with whom. Now in physics, classical physics, there's a very strong theoretical foundation that offers us to model homophily structure by using what we call preferential attachment theory. So each attribute, each node will have a set of attributes, and we try to look at a large-scale longitudinal data, and we try to actually look at whether the attribute characteristics have impact on how people affiliate with each other. So here, some of that work that I present, so here's a very well-established work in physics, definition of attachment. Here's very established work in analytical sociology on homophily, for example. And here's also a very well-established work in social psychology that talks about degrees of separation. And these guys were all mathematicians. I either worked at Cambridge or Harvard in maths department, but they were working in collaboration with psychology before social psychology came about and before computation started, because it was applied mathematics in those days. So 6 degrees of separation as well is that, is there any way we could understand how many links we need to pass to before we get to each other? It's not 6 nodes, it's 5 nodes, 6 steps that you go through that. It's been actually well studied in psychiatry. Colleagues sometimes say, oh, this 6 separation theory is a scientific theory. And I said, the seminal work in 1943 was done by psychiatrists, trying to understand how to find people because they were getting lost from a mental home institution. And later on, the work was about putting names of people together and then sending this to around the world and see whether it could come back to you. So how many steps that you need to go through. So there's a very strong foundation for mathematics, sociology, and computation. So now computation comes in because all these networks that we used to study, either in social anthropology, tribal networks, or sociology, were hand-drawn, right? Small-scale network. So now what we have is we are in a computational evolutionary phase where we could begin to start thinking about adding value. So I will say, in respect to my colleague who works in social science, keep the traditional methods, but add value of large-scale computational analytics to extract meaningful social behavioral data that could be calibrated in combination with the other traditional methods to really provide a significant advancement. Now, the second thing I'm taking, in terms of resilience and when dealing with disaster, large-scale computation and studying social and organizational behavior is very, very timely, right? Because as the system starts behaving, people start propagating information, and you can actually real-time capture that, build model, and provide real-time feedback to the system. Okay? So all these things, when you talk about that, one of the area that captures the theoretical work of system science and complex systems, basically what we try to do is say the world is made up of so many interconnecting micro and macro elements. And as this component changes, it creates an impact to the global changes, and global changes creates impact to local changes. Okay? So we need to understand the system as a dynamical system and how they evolve over time through interactions and feedback in different types of processes. So here, when I talk about the theoretical work on complexity and complex system science, integrated science, what I mean that you really need computation, a bit of mathematics, a bit of physics, sociology, psychology, and an eye of psychology. So training somebody in that area takes time. And you will see a lot of people, they actually understand. People who work in network science and field of networks, they actually can cross across the boundaries and use that. So because there's a singular theoretical foundation that could somehow use as a scaffold to hold this different discipline together. So I would talk about that as a theoretical foundation just to steer some debate and interest there. And I'll show you my work over the last 10 years where, these are some of the contexts where I applied this work in flood, fire, disease outbreak. Using new media, we have done work in Ebola. Can we actually construct how the Ebola coordination happened using social media data? Would that help us to improve our future? Can we create lessons learned report, for example? I'm working with currently over 10 million tweet data for the Syrian biochemical attack. I wanted to understand how the social system, civil societies participated as the biochemical unfolding. If I have resources, I want to reconstruct the Paris bombing event by backtracking and collecting all the social media data that happened during the time frame so that we could build model and saying that we could have actually detected this signal much earlier and we could have intervened in the system and corrected the behavior. That's my thesis. So that's pretty much my overall presentation. And I actually applied this underlying thesis across the field. I kind of became so passionate now. People say, oh, you work in health, you work in... I said, but I'm actually studying one single thing I've been doing for the rest of my life. But I actually can now see that from physical, social life, all the sciences, they could be all understood by using a singular theoretical construct. And that's what I've been promoting. But when I promote that, I'm also respectful to colleagues who does other things as well. But then I sometimes start to ask them, how else can you model the social system if you don't study the networks? But there's a different way of doing it. Okay, so that will capture my presentation. So it's theory, context, and then resilience building and community resilience. So the structure that I have here, just to guide you through. So I slowly start giving you a little bit of a theoretical basis. I don't want to, just the basics and some key work that's been already done. I want to showcase that it's been done in physical science, life sciences, social sciences, and behavioral sciences, the networks, and some profound, interesting work. So I want to present the idea of, so I'm doing setting up cities. I want to present the idea of a computational social science. I go around the world and tell colleagues that, guys, I'm not the only crazy person who's talking about the change that's coming in social sciences. Princeton, 1948, John Stewart, the head of physics, was instrumental in driving the idea of creating a social physics department, because they wanted to understand how do we make social sciences, other sciences more rigorous, okay, by drawing onto the methodological and modeling foundations from physics. So one of the things that's been promoted the last 10 years, 2009, the first paper appeared in Science. It was written by 7 top scholars from top institutions, from psychology, physics, sociology, social anthropology. They all came together saying, let's construct one singular paper, and we all agreed to that, saying that this is a big thing, computational social science. So I'd like to present to you computational social science as a way that could be applied in a number of areas, which builds onto the notion of complex design and complex systems. Theories and modeling approaches. Then I'll give you some examples about, just a snapshot about the kind of work that I've been doing, overarching model and the kind of empirical investigation and the outcome. And then I can show you some links. And I, of course, obviously see the links here because of the theoretical and methodological work that I do. I go into business community, I've been talking to Alan Cuss for a number of years on using systems approach to understand dialysis management process for indigenous community. Because let's use systems thinking and systems approach and look at the whole thing as a social and a behavioral and technology enabling system to understand how do we actually improve the overall healthcare. So you could do that. So I have obvious connection here, a known number of colleagues here with Douglas and others. I also see connection with the Health and Wellbeing International Graduate Education Center and Indigenous Knowledge. So nice connection with some of the things that you guys do here. So the first thing now, this is a piece of work came out from the ETH Physics Department. The ETH Physics Department basically said, the financial crisis, the whole world, the business economics people, they're saying, oh my God, who would have known this catastrophic financial disaster could come? And the physicists said, no. If you start building model, you could question, challenge the accuracy, but at a global scale, it doesn't matter anymore once you can actually construct model. They were able to actually construct a micro and macro interaction model and look at and trying to identify financial failure in the system. And what they found that it was almost like an epidemic outbreak, that a lot of this microsystem failure in the financial market was happening and we weren't correcting those behavior. So it was, cancer was growing in the financial market system and then it was propagating and becoming bigger and bigger and it was then collapsing the entire system. Here you're talking about financial biological system. So this is a paper Nature. A few colleagues here, one colleague here when I visited, he said he doesn't do that, but that's, it's a Nature paper from ETH Physics. I kind of believe that the work they have done has profound impact here, saying the social system and behavioral modeling, and they looked at that as a connected system. So one of the things, Helbing, who's one of the leading scholars, appears in Nature and Science very frequently. You'll see him. He's been advocating that we don't understand risk and systemic problem because we're not able to look at the whole, conceptualize, step outside the boundaries of a traditional discipline, and try to really look at the problem. So that's the whole notion of transdisciplinary research, using multiple theoretical and methodological construct to drive transformational, impactful research challenges matters to society. So what Javier has been saying that we don't understand this thing because we fail to understand the interconnectedness and interdependencies, because there are many, many elements, micro and macro, and they interconnect with each other. And you could actually apply that concept in behavior. What drives behavioral change when students, children, people are increasingly part of a computer-mediated environment? How does information flow and noise or overload have impact on changing the behavioral dynamics, for example? So you could look at the information theory approach. So this is a very significant work. I just put a quote here saying that the world is, unless we understand that, then we don't understand. So transdisciplinary notion comes in because when you're looking at solutions to a lot of global challenges, either health, environment, financial market, that
really requires, in my most humble opinion, requires us to get rid of the territorial. We need the territorial boundary as a strength, but we need to come together and provide solutions. When I was at Sydney for 14 years before I moved to Hong Kong, I was part of a $1 billion center working with Professor Steve Simpson, cellular biologist, John Crawford, who's at Rothamsted now. We were instrumental in pulling people saying to understand cardiovascular disease needs social, behavioral, media, cellular, mathematical biology, computation, health, education, all these people together. And so if you want to do something meaningful, impactful work, we need to think about how to actually converge these different disciplinary ideas into a singular predictive framework and then use it as a way to drive transformational societal change. So look at Santa Fe, look at Oxford Internet Institute, Margaret's work, who heads the institute there. Let's look at some of the centers around the world. You'll see that they actually have people who have traditional discipline, belongs to different areas, but they actually somehow work together on a bigger project which has big societal impact. So when we work on this, one of the challenges that we have is construction of those networks. Now, computation comes in because a lot of these networks, it would have been easier if the lines are already drawn. When you look at a large-scale networks, a lot of these interactions could be hidden. Now we need to make some assumptions. We need to now start thinking of formulating a problem, information theoretic problem, saying that how do we complete the connections, for example. So there are mechanisms. So it's also very elastic. So you find a lot of networks are kind of like this, where they're not connected. But now we could have a lot of formal methods to draw links. So there are predictive algorithms. Simple two things are suggested. One from prefixal attachment, which essentially looks at attributes of individual nodes and their evolution and their attachment behavior over time as a way to develop models to understand future attachment behavior. There's link prediction algorithm to saying that if we know the attributes and attachment behavior, are we able to predict the link of how a social structure will change in the future? John Kleinberg from Cornell. So this is a very well-studied theoretical work that's been done in the social sciences to actually really help us to understand how we do that. So one of the things is, if we use those theoretical paradigm, we could complete this graph. We start drawing links, and the thickness will represent how often we connect with each other. And one of the natural problem we have is when this network is heavily interconnected, the consequences of density means it creates a lot of noise. So optimization theory comes in saying, are we able to predict the tipping point of the system before it gets very, very noisy, and therefore it will drive a detrimental outcome. So we do that. Now, if we're able to do that, we can compartmentalize as well. We could also look at the whole Charles Darwin universe as a network, groups, subgroups, the interconnection. And if you really want to look at, the world is looking at it as a CDU, but CDU has its own structures and processes. We need to connect with each other to drive solutions to the problem. So we could map out a relationship in an organization, in an institutional setting, and look at how those institutions works. Now, two pieces of work that I was telling you that it's not me. I'm the less correct. You should really look at Watts and Stover's work, and fascinating work at Cornell, the work they're doing. Breakthrough mathematics, and then they use that thing now to look at work with Alex Barabasi, who comes in Nature and Physics very often, publishes there on looking at biological systems modeling and how that could be used to understand chronic disease problem. So the one theoretical problem led to the other. So what basically they've been advocating that a lot of individual behavior that we see, individual self-concept, self is part of its self-embeddedness within social structure. Self could be a node, it could be something else in a computational context. It could look at an atomic things and it could be a node. So what they've been saying that the experiment suggests that the group, the dynamics, for example, the relationship, the interaction helps shapes the individual self as well. You find that. The second one, so this is the Nature work that came out called Small World Network Experiment, very well established theoretical work. And Nature wouldn't publish a paper on that, so I trust them. The other one, I was telling you that a group of scientists from psychology, sociology, mathematics, they came together saying we want to construct this theoretical paradigm for computational social science. So David Lazar is at Harvard, Alex Pentland is the head of MIT Media Lab. You have Adam McAlvey, he's at HP Research Lab, director of HP Research Lab. Ariel Barabasi, physicist, one of the world's famous physicists who discovered this small world phenomena. He's at Northeastern. So they all work together. And this is a 2009 paper, my colleagues here. They already said that we could leverage that and start modeling and building model to explain and find answers about social and behavioral knowledge and science questions there. So the theoretical basics is there. So then what I suggest to you, I give you a little bit of a thing about what is this notion of complexity and complex system. And where does the notion of self-organization come? And how we could study living system to guide the social system. I was telling your BBCR, Professor Lawrence Camp, that there's a very significant research coming out in IEEE evolutionary computation saying that what we call guided self-organization. So what they're saying that if we study ants and bees and other living systems, the way they organize and find optimal pathway, we could use this as a construction of a model to guide the social system towards optimal behavior and performance. Okay? So, because of the real world, the system is made up of very interconnected components. It gives power, it's difficult to understand, predict, and manage. And also, these systems show emerging behavior, emerging characteristics. So this new work in evolutionary computation on guided self-organization really is instrumental in driving a lot of interesting work in social science and behavior and other areas. Because you're looking at leadership structure. How do we predict that? Is there a way of mathematical formulation to that, and can you actually build that kind of structure? So when we study complex systems, I tell colleagues, I'm interested in three things. Okay? So flow of information a system can support. Okay? And I could also constrain a system, build a simulator and a model to test the threshold limit of a system to deal with how much of information they could support. Right? So you look at flow of information they can support, robustness of the flow of the node failure. Now, what we do in a global network, these are all, hubs are all connected, right? So the 6 degrees of separation, Professor Barabasi's work, that came out in Science, famous. You know why it became famous? Because he predicted the evolution of Google, how Google and Internet would evolve, the Internet structure. And the fundamental principle, what he highlights there, is the concept of hubs and spokes. So you have the concept of, so if you break down, so when you talk about robustness of the failure, we're not interested in one singular node failure, because a singular node in a global context doesn't matter, because these nodes seem that they are connected. So we look at the impact of a failure of a hub on the overall dynamics of the structure. Because if you fail a system, a hub, for example, means one group and a central group. So you can look at it in an organizational psychology saying different groups and different central figure. If I fail one, it will completely dismantle the dynamics of the network structure. So we look at that. So simulation model has been very, very useful in preparedness, saying that, okay, how do we prepare communities and organizations for dealing with catastrophes? If let's superimpose certain constraints and see how the system will behave, for example, and then use it as a way to train. When we do that, we also try to find optimal pathways. Optimization is very, very important because particularly when dealing with chaos, everybody is going to be noisy, right? So we need to find out what is the most optimal pathway, direct way I could send the information to you, okay? And what is the most economic efficiency? So here, the work basically talking about, when you talk about that, we're talking about different types of network design. And do I connect to all nodes, or do I connect to a number of nodes that has very strong central links, means they connect with other? The theorem that's been developed to look at degrees of centrality was the classical work by mathematical sociologist, Professor Leighton Freeman. At UC Irvine. So when I refer these, even one has a theoretical basis in mathematical sociology that fills the gap. But let me show you some characterization of that. So this, so the earlier characterization of the work, I tell colleagues, because sometimes they say, oh, you're studying social networking, Facebook. I said, no. There are foundations that's been drawn in physics and social physics going back to some very classical work in 1500. And some of the modern work was Stuart on the left. He was a head of physics department at Princeton, who was instrumental in saying that let's create a social physics department. Alex Pentland is the head of MIT Media Lab, who actually recently wrote a book on social physics for modeling social system and understanding social behavior. The classical work that I rely on, and I thank to Douglas, Professor Alex Douglas, who worked during 40s, and his PhD thesis was completed in late 40s at MIT, which is a classical piece of work on using mathematical theory to explore the implications of group structures on outcome. And he did an experimental work, so I run a reading group for my doctoral students and junior faculty. I actually give them a series of reading of this. Read Douglas first. Let's tease it apart. Let's try to understand the underlying mathematics of structure and how that. So he's one very, very profound. Social capital, Coleman work was also very, very profound in terms of looking at networks of contact. Mark Gallenberger's work, he was at he found that as the ties get stronger, it has a natural tendency to create a lot of noise. Therefore, it doesn't give you innovation and learning. So in economic sociology, he has the potential to be a Nobel laureate. He's at that level. He's at Stanford now. So this is the one piece of work. Theories of strength of ties is 38,000 times cited. Just one paper. So, and almost, I actually did a bibliometric mapping of his work. It almost influenced every single discipline. You know, I used the wave of science data to see how it propagated. And then I tried to understand what was about his theory that made so much influential impact. What is the foundation for building that? So, what he suggested that weak links, casual acquaintances, have greater impact on supporting innovation and learning. And that was part of his doctoral dissertation. So his PhD thesis is a book that's published called Finding a Job. But underlying thesis is economic sociology of strength of weak ties. So you really have to look for it, because if you look at the book title, you say, oh, okay, this is about finding a job, but nothing to do with it. Network exchange theory by Wheeler. He's again a mathematical theory. He talked about inclusion-exclusion principle, where in a knowledge-building system where we could there is a structural embeddedness to inclusion-exclusion. So he gave birth to this very strong, interesting theoretical principle called theory of inclusion-exclusion, and how there's a structural embeddedness to that. So it means the way we connect. So for me, Douglas and Timothy, the way we connect to each other, we could create a system where it will not allow for a number of you to be interconnected with us, for example, in terms of supporting information. Now, let's scale that up to 1 million population. That's where you need computational analysis of understanding, exchange, and information. Governance, that fits World Business School, some of the work they do by the work of Borgatti. He's at Kentucky. And the structural host, which deals with efficiencies of networks, which is the work of Ronald Bart at the University of Chicago. I'll just show you a representation of how this looks like. So when you look at these theories, for example, let me just show you. So when you look at these theories, this is a classical example of the work of efficiency and efficiency of networks. So rather than connecting with all nodes, and we know that as we grow our network, we start connecting with more and more. We also know that we can manage only a number of links and manage this relationship and maintain our performance level. So what the studies have shown that a simple classification using Freeman algorithm from UC Irvine, centrality algorithm, for example, we could think that given large network structure, we could identify central figure and connect with the central node and make the assumption that all other nodes are connected with the central figure, and therefore we get the same information benefit by connecting with 4 nodes rather than connecting with 16 nodes. Does it make sense? And think about this situation in a crisis situation, for example. So we're talking about, so that's where optimization and efficiency theory comes in, saying that what is the optimal number of links that we need to maintain a good support information flow? And beyond that point, what is the determinant effect of that to create a tipping point where unless you face transitions to second order phase transition, then it has a natural tendency to drop. Strength of ties, Professor Ganawa's work, they were saying that somebody could breach the link between 2 parties, for example, and in a secondary fashion. The role of centrality, Freeman algorithm provides that. So you look at betweenness, closeness, different types, and that has impact within the social context, within organizational context. Consequent density. So when you look at this figure, centrality figure, so here's an example of when you look at betweenness, means in an algorithmic sense, betweenness offers an extent to understanding control in an organizational context. How 2 groups are controlled by a particular node who sits in between that particular structure. Degree represents activity. So we find that sometimes a noisy system, a lot of individual nodes, they're sending each other information like crazy, for example, but it doesn't translate to anything. It actually creates more noise. Sometimes we wonder whether that's actually manufactured to make the system more noisy by increasing the propagation of information to make them not performing well. Closeness represents independence. So these structures, when you study from sociology, from mathematics, from computation, you can translate them into social and organizational studies and apply that to understand social and organizational behavior. Okay? So I back that a little bit now. The other theories that I've been looking at as well in my work is when I became interested in looking at optimal functioning of networks. And the classical work that I came across was the Nobel Prize winning work by Professor Jern, who was a Danish scientist, worked again at ETH, who was the first one to saying that I could use graph theoretic approach to explain cellular functioning and immunity. So the immune network theory, if you really read the paper, it's actually quite a classical paper. What he wrote was about there's this notion of structures, embeddedness, connections, and all those principles applies there. So I read that paper as a way to understand how do I immunize a social system. If we have a cellular system that has an immunity to structure, social system mirrors similar kind of structural properties. Are you able to look at the immunity level building there? Prediction, I talked about the physics work, Noel's work on preferential attachment, and that's John Kleinberg. He became a full tenured professor at Cornell in mathematics at the age of 29. And I think he's one of the third most cited mathematicians because of his work on link prediction. Again, which is quite simple. He worked with Jonathan Hancock, quite similar to Timothy. So Jonathan Hancock is the head of social psychology and information science at Cornell. And Kleinberg is in a computation and mathematics. And they work together saying that, you know what, can we think about looking at how people share their information in social media? Are we able to predict whether they will form groups, whether they will get married, different types of social and behavioral outcome? And what sort of mathematical complexity do we have here? So they wrote a paper in PNAS recently as well on talking about a million Facebook users' data, interactions and the content they model it, and they're saying that they could see the evidence of contagious behavior of emotions. Because how you use your set of keywords to express your behavior over 5 years, if I start looking at all your connected groups of networks, they're finding experimental evidence. There are challenges, but this is the PNAS paper, they're acknowledging their work and they're published there, saying that you could understand emotions and the behavior of the problem in a computer media context by mapping out the relationship how it works. Chris Douglas and others, they have used this work in a medical context. So when I work across the field, I just like to use this as a backing, saying that there are other scholars who actually cut across this discipline and they look at that, this particular work. Some of the new work that I'm doing operational, I have this thing about looking at crisis management, but looking at that from combining computational physiology and neurology into the complex adaptive system. So using the neural data and the physical data, put them into decision-making model and create a decision box that will capture the brain data and the physical data. It doesn't cost much. You just a hat and you need a wristwatch. There are a lot of experiments you could do with collecting different types of physiological data and use in the context of emergencies. So we call it neural. So if there are modeling approaches. So when we study these networks, we're interested in, there's a number of areas that's been applied. So it's a mapping I did over last 30 years of research in that space. Because almost every field has a natural tendency to understand and embrace the concept of networks. I wrote a paper in Scientometrics on looking at 30 years of network science research in multiple fields and how different disciplines have used them, for example. And when they use it, they look at actors and the relationship and links. They look at how relationships are formed over time. They try to quantify them. They try to predict how relationships could be formed, for example. And they try to also look at the quality and necessity of ties. So now, if I construct a model, I think about the system dynamical model, input, process, output, and a feedback loop, okay? And space and time. So simple. So you have certain elements of input, you have a processing element, you have an output, you have a feedback loop, means that takes feedback from the system, drives the change to the behavior, and this whole thing is happening as an adaptive system over space and time. So the spatial temporal modeling of systems, for example. So a generic model would be input information, how that self-organizes behavior, how that produces output. And at each context level, if you want to understand if you want to look at the structure as a representation of how a system cope with that through different types of intervention as they receive, then you may be able to look at the networks at different level and look at the intervention, how that changes the dynamics and produces network 2, and look at the differences. Because once you construct them as a graph, you could actually mathematically see the difference between graph 1 and graph 2. You could calculate the degrees, the centrality, the values of those graphs, and you could see the shift that happens between different times of changes, for example. This one I talked about that. There's some other theoretical work that I do on predicting links. And the links prediction is quite simple. We have now a lot of algorithm and computational tools that could be used to simplify, to establish links. So sometimes there is no direct links, but a node could be related to the nodes that could be related to the other cluster. So there are three-step process to devise a hidden structure on how nodes could be affiliated with each other in predicting of the system. The overlapping is another problem in a community data. When you're dealing with large-scale data, these communities are not just one community. Sometimes they're shared communities. So it means they have affiliation across multiple institutes. So here, academics, you may be bringing in somebody who may have appointments in 3 places, so they get 3 input. How do we actually detect this shared community structure? What are the challenges? And how do we actually automate the search to extract all this large array of data, and which could help us to generate, visualize the shared community structure? We have done work and developed some algorithms there to build that up. The last one was the initial work started in psychology by Professor Pete Patterson, who's now at DVC Education at University of Sydney. She was a provost at University of Melbourne. So Pat's background is in mathematics, physics, and psychology, and worked with Gary Robbins, and they gave birth to this whole complex interesting phenomena called how do you slice and dice a graph to look at the formation of the whole, but over space and time by looking at smaller chunks of that. So they call it, so the mathematical tool that they have developed called exponential random graph modeling, and the underlying principle of that is that you could actually look at them at a very, very edge level or three-node structure, and you could begin to complete, when you look at a complete graph, you look at a global picture, you could backtrack and reverse engineer the process and rebuild those networks to actually see how they were formed. So this theoretical principle, I apply that within the context of studying disaster and resilience. Okay, so within the context of disaster, for example, one of the things is that we have our hidden networks. We have these groups of people. They work together, but they are not. They're working. There is something underneath, behind the chart, that actually hold them. Without that network, it doesn't work, because the blue ones. They're not formal. They're actually informal. They're because of the multi-jurisdictional challenges, you cannot actually have formal charts, for example. So what you do is you actually instigate this elastic, this shadow network, for example, that Ralph Stacey from Warwick in IO psychology talks about shadow network. That shadow networks to activate that to bring about change and integration of large-scale sub-networks to deal with the disaster. So the aspects of social science, humanities, and behavioral sciences. And Douglas is on that. I actually created, led with Douglas and other colleagues on a new journal, Frontiers in Communication. So there's 2 Frontiers in Science in Disaster Communication and Frontiers in Science in Psychology and Disaster Communication. Douglas is actually on the editorial board, but we have got together a global groups of leaders, about 40 academics came together and constructed that Frontiers journal. The resilience is a simple way. I think the best example of resilience is in medical field we find in nursing. I looked at Zalfer's work on people dealing with coping pain and how they cope with pain. And he was really studying them over a number of years. And medical field has a natural tendency to make longitudinal observations. So they have large data clusters, 30, 40 years people observe. And what he found that Zalfer's study, which came out in the adult resilience, in particularly looking at help people how they cope with the community, is that this notion of social connectedness. And different types of ties, going back to grammar. So you have professional tie, personal ties, social to family ties, and these ties were instrumental in supporting that. I further found evidence in the New England Journal of Medicine where the scholars have looked at pre- and postnatal depressive disorder and how different cultural communities, Anglo, Irish community living in New England area, the Latino community, and when they looked at the, trying to find out why do they show very diversified outcome in terms of pre- and postnatal depression, one of the answers was the connectedness, how the family bonding connectedness together. Because I work in young infant child feeding with a colleague from Sydney and from Johns Hopkins. We're doing some work in networks of mothers' nutritional diet for children in Bangladesh, Hyderabad, and in Nepal. It's an international project. One of the things we're looking at is mothers' feeding behavior, particularly with regards to breastfeeding behavior, has a lot to do in those contexts with how they affiliate with the peer support network through Gates Foundation, but also parental network, in-laws network. So we're collecting multiple data sources from different networks, put them together to look at outcome, particularly here at Mount Nutrition. So it's been quite well studied in medical field, in health psychology, health sociology. And then, I've been looking at adaptation behavior for system and how do I understand how they could potentially behave if you have catastrophes happen. So by doing this kind of modeling. So that has impact on preparedness and response for natural bio-related disasters. Understanding jurisdictional boundaries, it's not so much of technology. You know, we published a paper just last year in PLOS, one of the top journal, using systems modeling for understanding the error rate in breast radiology. We collected data from, I worked with Patrick Behrman, who's one of the world leader in breast radiology. He comes from anatomy background in Sydney, with my skills in systems modeling and networks and performance, and we tracked 400 radiologists, and each of them had 100 film shots, screenshots, and we had the error data. We put them into basic, clustered them into from low, medium to high performing cluster. We went after each of those clusters, tried to further extract information about what kind of technology do they use, how do they affiliate, how do they gain access to professional knowledge. And what we found is that imaging technology has advanced so significantly, but it didn't reduce the diagnostic accuracy of breast. It actually somehow increased the diagnostic accuracy of breast, because we thought that technology could replace the social access to knowledge and using through social network. So what we found in our study so two papers we published. One is BMC, we published a paper on quantitative study on breast radiology. The other one is in PLOS, quantitative study. We found that the radiologists who continue to perform and show higher performance in diagnostic output had a greater access to professional knowledge bases where they were connected with the professional peers, and that was instrumental in giving them access to improved diagnostic output, not just the technology. So, so some of this work I've applied that, this is a work that Douglas has been part of that, which is the fire crisis, and how one of the things we had access to was that I had two PhD students. They were funded to the scheme where Douglas was part of, the C.S. Bushra. Royal Commission released a huge report about the firefighters' engagement rules and how they reacted to the fire and how different communities. So we used multiple data sources to construct a model to understand how the firefighters related. So first thing we did was that we actually, when you do a network modeling in a basic simple spreadsheet, who is talking to whom? We need to build a matrix structure and then use that as a way, upload that to start drawing a graph theory visualization. So we identified who are the key players there, what was their role in the fire crisis. This is the incident command control in Victoria. And what kind of tools they were using, who they were communicating with, which organization they belonged to. So we looked at the number of fires, Bunya, Kilmore, these are all Victorian large fire crises, and looked at how firefighters work. So by categorizing that what time, first thing we did was we presented a global model, and Douglas and I, and Chris Owen that I worked, one of the program, working with Douglas from education, they were leading, and I had two doctoral students working. One of the things we did was creating a global model to visualize clusters of each of these incident command controller and who they are talking and what was the involvement there. This gives us constructed that gives us a whole mathematical statistical output from this, so to calculate the power of every single node, betweenness of every single node, influence of every single node activity. So then what we do is that it gives us a way to identify all this statistical variable, means how strong they are, who's controlling, who is bridging the gap between two clusters, who is being active, and who is being able to work independently in a social context. So identify this. And then what we do is we start really looking at individuals' ability to perform during the crisis based on the data we have. And again, we're using those basic measures that I showed you, degree, closeness, betweenness, and the other one we use called eigenvector, which is basically influence. In a social context, when you look at someone's eigen means, we say, if we calculate your eigen means, your ability to influence others. So we draw physics, a computation approach of how you calculate. We apply that in a social context to look at the eigen of a firefighter as an incident command controller and how the influences they are. So we look at these values, for example. So this helps us then we start looking at, these networks change over time. Fire is a very, very exercise that's very time dependent. So we start then looking at that at time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4, and on and on. Because each of this time, we start noticing that the composition of the structure and the skill base are quite different. Because each node, we have the names of the organization, we could assume the skill base. So here, we start generating some further statistical output about how many actors, who were involved, which organization, what was their role, what was the level of centrality, who were in control of that. In doing so, what it does, it helps us to dice the overall graph that we have, the global graph, into a time-dependent one. So now, by having the statistical one, we could recalculate, we could look at the dynamic changes that happen to network structure at time 1, 2, and 3 using a graph theoretic approach, which this helps us to look at the key central figures and key central role in those networks. So it helps us to generate this. So here, we could look at who is providing information, who is seeking information, who is able to manage the group dynamics during that particular crisis. And so at a different time. And these are, again, real people who took part in the exercise. The data extraction was from the fire exercises. So this helps us to understand coordination, how they have done, and helps us to understand also how we would improve the coordination and support the brokerage role to build bridges across different clusters. Okay? I've done a similar work with a colleague from Florida, Naim Kapuchu, and we had access to 5 consecutive flood hurricane data, and the Francis, Charlie, all this thing hit in Florida over time, and we wanted to look at how the coordinating system responded to that, and what lessons learned we could actually have from there. So he's a doctoral student from Florida. They actually collected the data. We analyzed that in my lab, and we collaborated on that. So this is the major hurricane. So one of the things, so if you remember, there were Charlie, Francis, Ivan, and Janine. So when we extracted that data, we tried to identify first who are the lead organization, what was their role there, what was the composition structure and the skill base of each of the organization, what are the other types of resources they had. So we looked at, and then we tried to understand what kind of network structure does Janine Hurricane or Francis or Ivan Hurricane represent in terms of the coordinating tool. And then we looked at how efficient was the network structure to drive the outcome to safeguard the community. And so this led to a lessons learned report, which will help us saying how should we prepare the community in the future to deal with other types of catastrophes. Okay? I don't want to, I just wanted to, so I just briefly show you similar approach to the first one. We've modeled exactly similar types of application, similar theoretical principle within the context of that. And you can find the paper in the Cornell Library in the API, Emerging Networks, Natural Disaster, particularly dealing with here. Some of the other work that I'm doing, I think I told you that I have interest in disaster resilience, but within the context of resilience, I have interest in networks of resilience in human health. And this is something I'm passionate about. And health is an important part of the overall disaster management plan, but understanding human health. So I actually have a number of work that I do in health with Michael, who was at Hopkins, but now he's at International Health in Sydney, on looking at young and infant nutritional problem. There are over 1 million children die a year, and it's not because of being rich or poor. It's because of being able to have access to nutrition, diet and knowledge related to nutritional diet, what we know from nutrition. So I've collaborated with people. This is a work that's ongoing with Alan. We have a proposal. We haven't submitted, but I think I've been working with him for 3 years on discussing and making progress. We have met a few times even in Sydney. His family lives in Sydney, so he commutes there. And so we're talking about using systems approach to understand social and organizational community resilience for dealing with renal disease and others. The recent work that, and I have done some work on similar kind of work on breast cancer. I think I told you that PLOS paper you will find on looking at improving the diagnostic error of radiologists by looking at the study of social networks. Quite simple actually, because we had error data, we put them in different clusters, we modeled them, we went up to each of this cluster, we elicited the network structure and then built it. The other work we did was both qualitative and quantitative with 100 area health services for dealing with how Australian health area networks prepared for dealing with large outbreak for H1N1. And this required us to develop an instrument, a qualitative instrument where we surveyed a number of group of senior executives who were part of the disaster health management plan, and then develop a quantitative instrument to collect quantitative social network data. So this is a different data collection. So I'm actually quite familiar with multi-method data collection so this was an interview. We wanted to understand this, and then once we understood this, we looked at the theory and method, and we developed this, and then we collected the data to understand communications flow from different units within the hospital. They have critical care, medical care, central the sending command, and so that we are able to look at communications flow to at the end of the day, we wanted to actually model that who were the key links initiating, who were the providing, how intense were the links, for example, what was the purpose of this link, how long did this link's connection, this last with the health context. But we didn't have access to, so we had to actually build the data set from qualitative and conceptualizing and to building a survey instrument and looking at measurements, validity, and reliability. The latest work that I've been doing on simple looking at Ebola in Western African outbreak. And one of the questions I asked to colleagues that we have a large volume of, so the world was delayed by 6 months. The propagation started in March. So I looked at 31-week period to analyze the social media data, and I had a colleague who could read French, the Sierra Leone, a lot of data, information there in French. And the World Health Organization issued the warning 6 months later. And we were lucky that we didn't see a similar effect of a Spanish flu contagion, which killed 50 million people around the world. But this was a low scale. But what scared the whole world, that we failed to recognize the levels of propagation and early detection, and therefore intervene in the system to quarantine the system there. And we let it grow out of that small African Western nation to UK and the United States. So I wanted to actually showcase the world that, okay, early detection using social media, social computation, are we able to capture different types of early signals from the ground and build models which could be used to improve our coordination, because if we can build models, we could show that here is a propagation starting. It's not just one of isolated cases. So we looked at from infected, and so we built models, and then we looked at from healthcare worker, infected, discharged other workers, and from Madrid all the way up to Hossain, how many nodes were infected and which node was instrumental in infecting other nodes. All the data came from the social media data, means the French newspaper article data from Sierra Leone and other social media data. And the social media data, we had names of individual, we had names of the affiliation, we had their roles, and they were talking to each other. Okay? We extracted this, we built this model to show that we could actually potentially discover this kind of thing. The last one, I finished this is a 15-year study that I'm trying to summarize it, looking at the evolution of using computational algorithm to provide early detection to disease outbreaks. So I wanted to do a meta-analysis, which is quite common in medical field. And I actually collaborated with John Brownstein from Harvard, who has published an earlier similar kind of piece in New England Journal of Medicine. I was hoping that maybe having John, we should probably submit it in New England Journal of Medicine. So what we did is we looked at academic research and development of algorithm for detecting flu trend. Remember that Google was criticized for overshooting. You could use different algorithms to detect how the flu will spread and build model. So what we did, we said, okay, the academic research community has a natural tendency to initiate, build model. Somebody else will work on it, improve. So it's a dynamical system, right? So they correct each other's behavior. So why don't we build a model with that assumption, saying input, process, output, and feed all the seminal research output data in a computational modeling of epidemics outbreak over the last 14 years. Now we looked at Nature, New England Journal of Medicine, so very high profile publications. Altogether we had about 68 papers at that level from Nature and Science. And then we used a standard. So when you do a meta-analysis, particularly in medical field, you need to follow certain standards. And we use a standard called PRISMA. PRISMA gives us as rigorous guidelines about how to conduct an investigation. We use PRISMA as a way to build a database. Okay? In our own database, and then we put all the research data publication and coded them into our database based on how we want to actually measure. This criterion all came from PRISMA standard. So we followed the gold standard, the guidelines. And then we started building our database to start looking at the relationship between, so the one paper raised the limitation, one paper corrected the limitation. We're looking at the time that raising and correcting or improving. So what we did is, using this as a bibliometric study, we were able to look at a number of types of errors that comes out in this kind of study in medical field. And all our research paper over the last 14 years here is basically from Science, Nature, and New England Journal of Medicine that came in that particular field. So what we found that the limitations raised and limitations improved, there's a time lag and types of limitations. Okay? And so then we wanted to understand how this time lag in raising and improving limitations of the scientific community for developing algorithms for epidemic outbreak could be improved, understood by looking at the whole system of the dynamical network. So let's construct a network model and look at how paper 1 is related to paper 2. So I proposed the model and Douglas built onto that, and so there's a connection. So this is how we draw a network. And then Timothy said, okay, no, you guys really didn't incorporate this particular theoretical construct, so he added an additional construct. So here's another connection. So what we did is we used that bibliometric data and start looking at, from 2004 till 2014, we were looking at paper as a node, and then the citation links and co-authorship as the links, for example, and constructed a model to show how the system corrects its behavior through social interactions for academic research community. This is still not finished yet. I'll actually send a piece of this paper to either PNAS or New England Journal of Medicine. The reason I'm hoping that because the collaborator is John Brownstein, who published earlier work in that area, and I'm actually building onto his work. And John has been successful in publishing in New England Journal of Medicine. So that's John Brownstein from Harvard. He works on health epidemic modeling and other things. So so what I presented here is that a theoretical concept of understanding the world as a system and the interrelationship and interdependencies and how complexity science and theories and methods from multiple places could be integrated as a way, as an integrated science to understand problems and challenges here for disaster and health outcome. Now, I also tell this to other colleagues when I visit their place, is this is a work came out from engineering showing the obesity system diagram where all different disciplines need to be integrated to look at that. So there are work in that area. I didn't show you guys this because, I mean, it's there. I have published about 200 ISI journal papers, and some of them in the top journal. So my ideal place, and I published a lot in public health journals, some of the top public health journal and disaster medicine journal. And so I kind of feel, in my humble opinion, where I would like to see my work would be in like Nature and Science and PNAS. And so I want to go to a place where that line of thinking and integration could lead to work in that area. And in terms of grants, I think I'll be, I uphold Discovery, NHMRC, and international grants as well. I see links to education, university-wide. In Hong Kong, I introduced a PhD course, Complex System for the entire university. I have buy-in from 7 deans, and I have students coming from social, behavioral, electrical engineering, physics, nursing, taking my PhD course on modeling of complex systems. And then they apply their own discipline to understand that particular phenomenon. I finish here and hand over to Douglas or Timothy.
Thank you first.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions to start, or does anyone have to leave? I know we're
I'm going to have to do one, but I'll ask you lots of questions tonight. So.
Sure, thank you.
There's one thing that strikes me is how similar, and I'm sure a lot of people say this to you, how similar this is to their own fields. And one of the things I think is really interesting, but you may not think it is, that in ecological research we can look at network analysis that's both quantitative and qualitative, and in the area I study, it's microbiomes, and they're interesting because they do sense each other, so they're a model for cities and how they interact. So there's new theories around, we used to think they were just sort of bacteria that were just responding to pH or salinity. They actually communicate with each other. So they're a really interesting model. And so you can do qualitative and quantitative network analysis, but we talk about things like keystone species when we look at higher organisms, but now we realise we can talk about them at the microbial level too. And I was looking for those words, and I was interested to know what you think. With ecological modelling, now that we know we can do it with microbiomes, we can talk about keystone species, that they're only keystone, you can take them out and then everything falls apart by definition. If you take them out and everything still goes on happily, then they weren't keystone.
That's right. Yeah.
So are there any analogies in this in terms of the concept of keystone?
So maybe in different disciplines, but the work that's been carried out by a physicist in really looking at networks and complexity, Baravasi, who really published, so one was the prediction of Google and internet and all this thing, the hubs and concept of hubs and spoke, for example, and how many hubs and how hubs are constructed, for example. So they, because that has a function of integrating a large number of nodes to that node. And so if you fail that will change the dynamic, because there's this notion of self-organization. So the whole system may not fail, but it will take a different sort of dynamic of structure.
Yeah.
And there are tools that you could use. I use a tool called Aura, and I trained a colleague of mine from Carnegie Mellon who knows how to do the spatial temporal modeling, dynamic network, quite complex, and you could do it in real time and show how, as you take out one of these nodes, for example, which could be potentially a hub that provides connection, what happens to the whole dynamics of the network. So you get a mathematical formulation of phase 1 and change of one node and how that will have impact on phase 2. You get immediately that response that's here. So that's actually probably quite useful in saying that how a real system could behave. As I was saying that in evolution computation now, the colleagues are working towards saying that if we understand, before natural scientists will say, oh, there's no point studying ants and bees because humans are not like that. Okay? But if you look at ant colony optimization model, all this thing has been used in logistics, supply chain, and other area. Now colleagues are saying that by studying the efficiency and the optimal functioning of a self-organizing system, we could start thinking about a notion of a guided self-organization for living as part of the system to guide them. So I think, there are potential, there are opportunities. Now, as I was telling you, I will look at the paper and I will probably email you. There's a paper last that came out in Nature talking about network modeling for environment and ecology. So, first it's really showing that how the basic principles, because these basic principles are also studied in biological networks. It also studied in transport networks. I mean, transport hubs and transport networks and connections. It also studied in air traffic networks, because they are all networks. So, yeah. So, yes, we'll do that. Jeffrey West could be, I don't know, who used to be the president of Santa Fe, a physicist who works in global cities and prediction of global cities and scaling of cities and modeling. I think he's retired now, but he still works in Santa Fe as a professor. He does quite similar kind of social ecological modeling.
So I'm actually one of Doug's PhD students.
You are? I thought you were a professor already.
Oh, thank you. I did that today. That's great. And so, funnily enough, I'm actually doing social media research myself.
Okay. So do you get it? Or you want to talk about it?
And so originally when I was looking at my designs, I was looking at mixed methods at the beginning of my project, and I stepped away from that to focus on qualitative research. I was trying to grapple with this whole, how can we start to piece together that quantitative network perspective to a more qualitative understanding as well. And so I just, it was really fascinating, and I've written down some papers I want to read. But in terms of
you could also get a copy of that, Alexandra, because I could leave this here and then maybe get a copy of the presentation.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Yeah.
And also any other works, are you working on anything, or do you know anyone else who has published stuff looking at sort of combining that qualitative and quantitative perspective when looking at networks?
Yeah, we saw one of the interesting things we did, and the Australian government and the Breast Association became very much interested. So I worked with Sarah Lewis, a colleague of mine at Sydney BMRI, the Breast Optimization Imaging Group, and Patrick Behrman, who's the head of the BMRI. And we published 2 papers, one in PLOS 1 and one in BMC Medical Imaging. And the work was simple. Does network have impact on performance outcome? How do we begin to explain the a very diverse outcome that happens with the mammographers when they do the screening of the breast cancer? And we have data. Can we cluster this data and put them into categories or groups of low performing, medium performing? This is simple. Okay, if we do a clustering of that, can we go after each of those clusters, trying to understand what makes them a sustained, because we have data over time, 5 years, what makes them a sustained high performing cluster? What is that? Can we extract that as a workflow model? And can we then, use that workflow model to design training mechanism to improve the overall performance of the breast radiologist, which will have significant impact on saving lives? So when we did that, now we actually, so we're going to have an NHRC partnership then, because the communities are interested. So you could look at that. There we use mixed methods, because we first have to understand how mammographers work, how radiographers work, how they interact with each other when they see a film. We also had to, we attended the radiological workshops and interviewed a number of high-performing radiographers, mammographers, based on the quantitative data we have.
Yeah.
So we complemented, and we did a survey with 400, and then we had access to the same 400 observational data for their diagnostic output. So have a look at that. So if you do this just came out in 2016 in PLOS, dealing with social networks and performance for improving Australian breast radiological performance. And we use mixed methods for that.
Is it Bayesian network analysis as well?
We didn't do Bayesian, we didn't have, but you could actually do, there's,
I've read a little bit about Bayesian, but I've mainly focused on social network analysis in my readings. I'm not doing any of it. I have done
so there's a
sitting
quite,
waiting to
so
do it.
when you have the modeling tool for social, it's quite connects with the psychology and sociology, but when you get into complex network, it becomes quite close to physics, and it quite applies to biological networks. And that's where you'll see their work. And then when you get to Bayesian network, you find also in optimization. So yeah, I mean, you could leverage, maybe if you can learn, it would be quite wonderful, provided you have that level of data.
Yeah, I haven't had a look at the data recently to be able to determine how valuable it is in terms of getting that sort of complex system approach. At the moment, I'm just trying to, again, from a qualitative perspective, understand what it means to people before examining what the networks look like.
Yeah.
So somehow.
So maybe look at our PLOS paper, because it has integration of qualitative social network and quantitative.
Yeah.
And in both pieces, we're able to get in a VMC journal, which is a top medical journal, and PLOS in a top computation information science journal. So maybe link that and say, if you want to talk to me, I'm happy to talk via diagram.
Fabulous, thank you.
You're smiling, saying quite relaxed. Does it make sense?
Good. Yeah, that's interesting.
So it makes sense, okay. Because I thought nobody here on campus could understand except that person. but thinking about the world as a network, because we are part of that, we're living in it every day. And when you talk about information flow, connections, support, noise, there are work now, colleagues in the US doing with school children talking about the spread of emotional disorder as they use overly dense these networks and Facebooks and things like that. And some of the analysis they're doing is using CNLP, so statistical natural language processing, to process all the text data. So there's a large scale of computational machine learning, because you get millions of text and users interaction data as a qualitative data, and you start using computation, statistical and mathematical natural language processing to process that and to build this model, and then to say that, hey, we're actually seeing that based on different types of connectedness, there is a notion of contagious behavior of emotion as they are heavily relying on internet-mediated things for children and things like that.
Yeah, I was thinking about that earlier when you touched upon the kind of the spread of emotions through Facebook and other social media outlets, and I was wondering if you could, or if it's already being done, complement that data with some, a lot of people have Fitbits or
that's correct. Yeah.
with galvanic skin response or heart rates or that kind of thing. I don't know, you can also enter mood fluctuations throughout the day and so on. Whether you could complement, I just think about.
No, their colleagues at LSC, they're doing it. They wear the whole day. You can capture that. Yeah.
Depending on your phone, Samsung does that automatically.
Well, that's right.
You don't even need a Fitbit. Your phone's doing it.
Yeah. So, and whether that, can complement, I suppose, the textual analysis
So in Northeastern, they brought in groups of physicists, psychologists, medical scientists, political scientists, and put together this doctoral consortium network science PhD program. And they have PhD students coming in to get a solid foundation of study of the world, understanding networks from very basic to advanced level. And then they work with the supervisor in environmental science, in psychology, and behavioral science, using network science as an underlying theoretical and methodological framework to understand those contextual phenomena.
Well, I think that's a perfect place. That's very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, thank you.
Thank
so
you.
this is basically pretty much,
Yeah.
we just probably touch base via email.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Thank you.